Good morning students. In this video, I will continue the explanation of the chapter from literature, A Triumph of Surgery by James Herriot. Till now we have learned that Mr. Herriot was a veterinary doctor, and in this lesson he is narrating his experience of treating Tricki, the pet dog of Mrs. Pumphrey. When the condition of Tricki got worse, he suggested Mrs. Pumphrey to admit the Tricki to hospital. So, Mr. Herriot brought Tricki to hospital. Now, let's continue with the story. Here we will start from page 49, third paragraph. At the surgery, the household dog surged round me. Tricki looked down at the noisy pack with full dull eyes, and, when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing means smelling with nose, round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. Here, when Mr. Herriot reached his hospital, the other dogs came rushing to him. And just like as you will go home and your pet rush towards you, in the same manner, the other dogs in the hospital rushed towards him. But Tricki, in contrast, he just stared at them with his dull eyes. When Mr. Herriot put him on a carpet, the other dogs smelled him for some time and they found that it is an uninteresting object and they just ignored him. Next, I made up a bed for him in a warm loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings. And on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. In this para, narrator left Tricki. He says that he left Tricki on his bed nearby where the other dogs all lives. But he lied without any movement. No? For the next 2 days, Tricki was given only water and no food. At the end of second day, Tricki started showing some interest in his surroundings. On the third day, Tricki started making low sounds in response to the sounds made by other dogs. Next, when I opened the door, Tricki trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricki followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat, huge fat. When narrator found Tricki, he is responding to the sound of other dogs. He led Tricki to the dogs playing in the yard. He also sent Tricki, opened the door, and he also allowed Tricki to go and play with the other dogs. Tricki slowly followed the dogs around as they played with his huge, he tried to play with them with his huge fat body. Okay, next. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan dropped the food into the bowls. There was the usual headlock rush followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. During feeding time, as soon as the food was put into the bowls, all the dogs came and started eating in speed. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he will have some competition for the last part of his meal. Why all the dogs rushed in speed, as they knew that if they fell behind, if they will get back, then they have to fight for their meal. When they had finished, Tricki took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling. Jostling means moving and making his own path, his way towards it. Later, after the dogs were fed, Tricki licks the leftover pieces of the food from the bowl. Next day, an extra bowl was placed for him, but narrator was surprised as well as happy to see him joining the dogs for meal. Means the Tricki joined that group of dogs and rushed for food towards the food. Next, from then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medical treatment of any kind, but all he ran about with the dogs joining in their friendly scrimmages. Scrimmages means struggle. while playing. They used to fight. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times and hunting rats in the old den house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. So, that was the turning point of our Tricki. From then, he made rapid progress. He ran around with all the dogs, fighting them for food and hunting rats at night. Tricki was actually had a different kind of life now. Here, as with Mrs. Pumphrey, he was always getting pampered. But here, Mr. Herriot tried to treat him by changing his lifestyle without any medicines. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously. Anxiously means she was waiting with worry. In the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. Bulletins means news. I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convulsing rapidly. Convincing means he is recovering rapidly. Okay. In all these days, during all these days when Tricki was here in the hospital, Mrs. Pumphrey used to call Mr. Herriot many times in a day to know about Tricki's condition. And finally, Mr. Herriot informed her that he is recovering. Next, the word convulsing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricki's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. And when the bottles of wine began to arrive, it was to enrich Tricki's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. When Mr. Herriot told Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricki is recovering, but Mrs. Pumphrey was not convinced with that. So she started bringing dozens of eggs to increase the strength of Tricki and then bottles of wine to enrich his blood. The lunch became a kind of celebration for James and his partner, as all these eggs and wines was consumed by them. It was not giving to Tricki. Obviously, it was not good for him. There were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning and finishing luxuriously with the wine. Narrator is talking about those days when Tricki was there in the hospital and they were getting all these things, eggs and wine, sent by the lady, which they were having in their meals whole day and enjoying their day. It was a temptation to keep Tricki on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Collection means waiting for picking up. So they felt that they should, means when they were getting all these things, so they felt that they should keep Tricki as a permanent guest so they could enjoy all these things always. But he also understood, Mr. Herriot also understood the pain Mrs. Pumphrey gone through. So he called after 15 days, he called her and gave her the good news about Tricki's health and asked her to take him back. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur means driver, opened the car and I must make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Herriot, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" Now, in this para, narrator says that after informing Mrs. Pumphrey, within a few minutes, Mrs. Pumphrey arrived to the hospital in her luxurious car. She did not came out of the car as she can't able to believe that Tricki is well now. So, from inside the car, she asked Mr. Herriot to tell the truth about Tricki's health. Next, "Yes, he is fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I will go and fetch him." I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricki. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe. Lithe means moving easily, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in a great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. Mr. Herriot told her when Mrs. Pumphrey asked him to tell the truth. So Mr. Herriot told her about Tricky's wellness. Then he went to bring Tricki from inside. He found Tricki was busy in playing with other dogs. There was completely change was there in Tricki now. No longer he was a fat, bloated animal. Now he was full of energy and well muscled. Next, I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. Mr. Herriot carried Tricki back to Mrs. Pumphrey's car. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricki saw him, his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous speed, in a leap, and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled, look, ooh, and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. The minute Tricki saw his owner, he jumped out from Herriot's arms and rushed at Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She tried to defend herself as Tricki barked and licked her face. You all are aware of this feeling, na? Always if your pets are going to jump on you and they try to show their concern for you. Next, as the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Herriot, she cried. How can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery. So, when the lady left in car with Tricki, she, with her tearful eyes, thanked Mr. Herriot. She believed it was the triumph of surgery. So, I hope, student, now you all understood what was the triumph of surgery in the story. It was the victory of treating a fat dog without any medical treatment.